Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1883, the wind ran sharp and dry over the sagebrush hills near Buffalo, carrying with it the dust of far-off tracks and the weight of big choices. Phoebe Hartley stepped down from the eastbound stagecoach with a hand on her belly and the other gripping the worn leather handle of her carpetbag. The baby inside her kicked as if it knew this was the edge of something new. Her boots met the dirt as the coach rolled away, leaving her alone on the side of the road with nothing but a letter folded in her pocket and hope straining against the ache in her chest. She was 5 months along, the shape of her growing child just visible beneath the fabric of her faded blue dress. The man she had agreed to marry by post, a rancher named Thomas Granger, had stopped writing the moment she told him she was expecting. She had traveled across 2 states to meet a man who, for all she knew, had changed his mind. Her throat tightened as she scanned the empty road. No one had come to meet her. "You waiting on someone, ma'am?" The voice was low and calm, with a touch of curiosity. Phoebe turned, startled. A tall man stood a few feet away, a hat shading his eyes and a rolled-up coat tossed over one shoulder. He looked about 30, strong-shouldered, with sun-dark skin and a quiet steadiness in the way he stood. Dust clung to the cuffs of his shirt, and his boots were scuffed from miles of riding. "I was," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "But it seems he changed his mind." The man looked her over, gaze resting for a moment on the roundness of her belly, then returning to her face. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "Name's Braden Oakes. I got a ranch about 15 miles west of here." Phoebe hesitated. "I am Phoebe Hartley. I came to marry a man named Thomas Granger." Braden's jaw tensed. "Granger left town 2 weeks ago, sold off his cattle and took off for Colorado. Did not tell anyone why?" Her heart dropped. She blinked hard, trying to keep the tears from falling. "I suppose I should not be surprised. You got anyone else out this way?" "No," Braden nodded slowly. "Well, I cannot leave you standing out here. Come on. I will take you back to my place. You can stay the night, rest a bit. I will help you figure out what comes next." Phoebe looked at him. "Why would you do that?" He met her eyes. "Because you are alone, and that is not right." She studied him for a long second before giving a single nod. Braden helped her up onto his horse, then mounted behind her. They rode in silence through the wide, open land. The sun dropped lower, stretching gold across the hills. Phoebe leaned slightly against him without meaning to, the warmth of his chest steady at her back. She had not been held in months, not since things had gone wrong back in Chicago, not since the man who had fathered her child walked away without looking back. Braden's ranch sat in a shallow valley, a clean 2-room cabin beside a horse corral and a small barn. He helped her down gently, as if she might break. Inside, the scent of pine wood and coffee lingered. It was simple but tidy. She noticed that right away. A bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a stove, a shelf of books. No woman's touch, but no mess either. "I will sleep in the barn," he said quickly. "You take the bed." Phoebe hesitated. "I will just take the floor, and you are carrying a child. You take the bed." She nodded, too tired to argue. That night, after she had eaten the stew he cooked and cleaned her face with a basin of warm water, Phoebe lay on the soft mattress and stared at the ceiling. The baby kicked once, then settled. Outside, she could hear Braden's boots crossing the barn floor, the soft sound of a horse shifting in its stall. He had not asked questions, had not judged her, just helped. In the morning, Phoebe woke to the smell of fresh bread. She sat up slowly, holding her belly. Braden was at the stove, his sleeves rolled up, frying eggs in a pan. "Morning," he said, glancing back at her. She brushed her hair back and stood. "You really did not have to do all this." "I wanted to." She looked at him, then down at the plate he set on the table. Her eyes burned again, but she blinked fast. After breakfast, she stepped out into the yard. The land stretched wide, fence lines curling into the hills, wildflowers pushing up through the dirt. She walked slowly, her hand at her waist, and Braden joined her after a while, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Did you grow up here?" she asked. "Close enough. My father came west after the war. Built this place from nothing." Phoebe nodded. "It is beautiful." He glanced at her. "You thinking about heading back east?" "I do not have the money, and I do not want to go back, not really. There is nothing there for me." He was quiet a moment. "You could stay here, if you wanted." She turned toward him. "Why?" "Because you are kind. You are strong. And you have not once complained, even though you have been through hell." Phoebe swallowed. "I cannot ask you to take care of someone else's child." "You did not ask," he said. "And you do not have to." "But I want to." She stared at him, her heart thudding. "I have known you less than 2 days," she said. "And I have not stopped thinking about you once," he said. "Steady. I will not push you. But I meant what I said. I do not think you should be alone. Not now. Not ever again." Phoebe's breath caught. For the first time in months, she felt something shift. Hope, maybe. Or the start of something like love. And as Braden reached out, brushing a piece of wind-blown hair from her cheek, she knew it was not pity in his eyes. It was something far deeper. A week passed beneath Wyoming's wide sky, each day edged with the silver promise of late spring. The snowmelt had left the creeks full and running, the land soft underfoot, and the scent of damp earth lingered in the morning air. Phoebe settled into the rhythm of Braden's place without asking herself too many questions. There was safety in motion, in small tasks that did not require decisions. She swept the cabin floor each morning while Braden saddled his gelding and rode the fence lines. She read from the books he kept on the shelf, weathered copies of Whitman and Melville, and a volume of sermons with pages worn thin at the corners. The baby shifted more often now, and sometimes she'd sit on the porch with her stitching and hum to the child just under her ribs, low and careful, like she didn't want the wind to overhear. One afternoon, Braden arrived back from town with a bundle tucked under his arm. Phoebe met him at the door, brushing flour from her hands. "I picked up a few things," he said, setting the parcel on the table. She untied the string and unfolded the brown paper to find a bolt of pale calico cloth, a tin of peppermint drops, and a pair of tiny knitted booties. Phoebe stared down at the booties, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the soft wool. "Where did you find these?" "Mrs. Everly keeps them at the mercantile. Says she knits them during the winter months when the cold keeps her in." Phoebe looked up, eyes searching his. "You didn't have to." "I know," Braden said. "I wanted to." She traced the edge of one booty with her thumb, then folded them gently and set them aside. That evening, while the stew simmered and the light faded gold over the ridgeline, Braden leaned against the doorframe and watched her mend the hem of her only nightdress. "You always sew with such care," he said. "It's the only thing that ever quieted my mind when I was younger. My mother used to say I'd thread a needle before I could write my name." "Is she still living?" Phoebe paused. "She passed 2 winters ago. Consumption." Braden nodded slowly, not asking further. She set the needle aside and rubbed her temples. "Sometimes I wonder if she'd recognize me now. If she'd forgive the choices I made." "Phoebe." His voice was steady, but gentler than she'd ever heard it. "You don't need forgiveness for surviving." They didn't speak after that, but when she reached for her cup later, their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away. The next morning, the wind changed. A dry gust pushed through the valley, carrying the smell of cattle and the distant bark of dogs. Braden saddled up before sunup. "Neighbor's missing a steer," he said, adjusting the cinch. "Wants help tracking it." Phoebe stepped outside, the cool air pressing against her skin. "Will you be gone long?" "Back before dusk." He stopped beside her, resting a hand briefly on the porch rail. "If you need anything, there's a rifle behind the stove. Load's fresh." "I can manage," she said, though she didn't like the idea of him riding out alone. He hesitated. "Don't answer the door for anyone you don't know by name." "Braden." He looked back. "Why'd you leave the war?" His face shifted, almost too subtly to catch. "Because I saw what it did to men who stayed." She nodded, and he tipped his hat before riding out. The day stretched long. Phoebe churned butter in the shade, then sat by the creek with her feet in the water, the baby rolling slow beneath her ribs. She thought about the way Braden's hand had lingered near hers on the porch rail, not possessive, just close, like a promise not yet spoken. She knew what it meant to be taken in for a night. This wasn't that. By the time dusk settled, the sky turning lavender above the hills, she heard hooves on the trail. Braden dismounted stiffly, dust caked to his boots and jaw tight. "Did you find it?" she asked. He shook his head. "Coyotes got to it first. Nothing but bone left." She brought him water and a cloth to clean his face. He sat on the porch steps, silent as the stars came out. She sat beside him, drawing her knees up, one hand on her belly. "I never expected anyone to look at me the way you do," she said softly. He turned to her, eyes unreadable in the dim light. "I see you," he said. "Not what you've been through. Not what you carry. Just you." Phoebe didn't answer, but when she leaned her head against his shoulder, he didn't move away. His hand found hers in the space between them, fingers lacing with quiet care. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to fall apart. Rain came on a Thursday, thin at first, then steady by mid-morning. It tapped soft against the roof as Phoebe sat at the table sorting dried beans into a tin bowl. Braden returned from the barn with his hat dripping, the scent of wet leather clinging to him. He hung his coat by the door and stood a moment, letting the quiet settle around them. "You ever lived through a plain storm?" he asked, pulling off his boots. "No," Phoebe said, moving the bowl aside. "Just city rain. Gutter deep and black with soot." He nodded, ran a hand through his hair. "This kind's different. Comes in clean. Makes things honest." She watched him cross to the stove, where the fire had softened to coals. "You speak like someone who listens more than he talks. I never saw much sense in filling space that doesn't need it." Phoebe folded her hands in her lap, then looked up. "What made you decide to stay here after your father passed?" He poured water into the kettle and answered without turning. "The land didn't ask anything of me but work. That felt fair. Did you ever want more than that?" He set the kettle on the stove and leaned against the counter. "I thought I didn't, until you showed up." Outside, the wind shivered through the cottonwoods. Phoebe stood and crossed the room, her steps careful on the wooden floor. She stopped beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "I never expected kindness to feel unfamiliar," she murmured. Braden looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "You deserve a good life, Phoebe. Not just a place to land. I'm not sure I'd know how to live one. Not yet. You don't have to know now. You just have to want it." She nodded slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Then she turned back to the table and picked up her mending, the needle sliding smooth through the fabric. Later, after the rain eased and the light shifted to a dull pewter, Braden brought in a bundle from the barn. Wrapped in burlap, it gave off a faint herbal scent. He laid it on the table and untied the cord. "These are willow bark and wild mint," he said. "For your back, when it starts to ache. You boil them together, then soak a rag in the water." Phoebe ran her fingers over the leaves, surprised by the gesture. "Where'd you learn to use these?" "My mother. She didn't believe in doctors unless there was a bone poking through." Phoebe gave a soft laugh. "Sounds like someone I would have liked. She had fire in her bones. Kept my father honest." She looked up. "And you? Who keeps you honest?" "I try to do that myself. But lately—" He paused, eyes meeting hers. "Lately I think you're helping." That night, the clouds broke just enough for a sliver of moon to edge across the floorboards. Phoebe lay awake, the baby shifting low in her belly, her hand resting lightly over the movement. The quiet was deep, broken only by the creak of timbers and the occasional rustle of wind against the shutters. She rose and padded barefoot to the door. The air outside was damp and cool, the scent of wet sage thick in the breeze. Braden stood under the eaves, one hand resting against the post. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said softly. "You didn't. I never sleep long when the weather turns." She stepped beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off his arm. "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He didn't answer right away. "Then, when I was 16, I buried a colt that broke its leg in a ravine. My father told me to leave it, that coyotes would get it by morning. But I couldn't. So I carried it out and laid it down proper. Covered it with stones." Phoebe looked at him, her voice quiet. "That's not a story most men would share." "I wasn't most boys," he said simply. She nodded, her voice low. "I think that's why I feel safe here." He turned his head, eyes dark in the moonlight. "I'm glad you do." They stood in silence, the kind that says more than words. Then she leaned against him, just enough to let him know she was there, and not going anywhere. His arm came around her, slow and careful, his hand resting at her hip. Nothing rushed, nothing asked. Just the comfort of being in the right place, at last. Inside, the fire had burned low, but the warmth lingered. When they finally returned to the cabin, she didn't go straight to the bed. She paused by the stove, watching him stoke the embers back to life. He caught her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. Not promises, not yet, but something that would carry them there. By early June, the earth had dried beneath the sun's patient persistence, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned full and green. Phoebe's ankles swelled in the afternoons now, and Braden had begun hauling water from the well so she wouldn't need to walk the slope behind the house. He never made a fuss of it, just did what needed doing, quiet and sure. That morning, Phoebe stood beside the old work table under the eaves, slicing apples thin for drying. The paring knife had belonged to Braden's mother. She'd found it tucked behind the flour tin, still sharp and balanced as a good tool should be. The blade moved in steady arcs, and the smell of fruit and open air made her feel, for a moment, like this life had always been waiting for her to arrive. Braden crossed the yard with saddle oil on his hands and a thoughtful crease between his brows. "Ryder came through while I was at the north fence," he said, reaching for the jug of water beside the door. "Said he passed a man asking after a woman fitting your description. East of here. Couple towns out." Phoebe's hand paused on the apple. "Did he give a name?" "No. Just said the man looked rough enough to be trouble. Didn't smell like trail dust either, more like whiskey sweat." She laid the knife down slowly, eyes on the grain of the table. "I never told him where I was headed. Or maybe I did. It's hard to remember that week." Braden didn't press her. He waited until she looked up. "I don't want to run again," she said. "I've done enough of that." "You won't have to," he said. "Not while I'm standing." That night, she didn't sleep. The air was too close, heavy with the storm that hadn't come. She sat in the rocking chair near the hearth, one hand resting on her middle, the other holding a letter she'd never sent. The ink had faded, but the words still pressed hard against the page. She read it once more, then fed it to the flame. Braden stirred when he heard the crackle. He came in from the barn in his undershirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat at his temples. "You all right?" he asked. She rose and stepped closer. "There's something I need you to know." He waited. "I told the father I'd raised this child alone, that I didn't want anything from him, and I meant it. But after I left, I still hoped he'd come after me. Not to take me back, just to say I mattered, once." Braden's jaw flexed. "Did he?" "No." She shook her head slowly. "And now I think maybe that was the best thing he ever did for me." Braden stepped forward, his voice low. "You don't need his name, or his memory, or anything he didn't give freely." She nodded, swallowing. "But I still wonder what kind of mother I'll be. You'll be the kind that stays. The kind that teaches strength without cruelty." Phoebe's eyes filled, not with sorrow, but with the strange, aching relief of being seen. "I want to make this a home," she said, her voice trembling. "Not just for me. For you. For the baby. If you'll have that." Braden didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and laid his hand gently over hers, where it rested on her belly. The child kicked once beneath the contact, and Phoebe drew in a breath. "I already do," he said. The next morning, Braden rode into town for supplies. Phoebe stayed behind, sorting linens and sweeping dust from the windowsills. The afternoon passed in quiet, broken only by birdsong and the occasional creak of the rafters. She stitched a baby gown from the calico he'd brought weeks earlier, tiny seams, careful hems. When she finished, she folded it and placed it in a drawer beside the knitted booties. By the time Braden returned, the sun was low behind the hills. He brought flour, coffee, a spool of thread, and something wrapped in oilcloth. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a carving, a small horse, whittled from pine, smooth and unfinished. "For the baby," he said. "I thought it should have something that's been touched by my hands too." Phoebe held it in her palm, speechless. She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "You didn't have to, I know." She reached for him then, not in fear, not in longing, but in something steadier. She wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her cheek against his chest. He held her there, his chin coming to rest gently atop her head. No more waiting. No more wondering where she belonged. Just this. A home built not from obligation, but from the quiet, daily choice to care. Outside, the wind shifted. This time, it brought only the scent of sweet grass and the promise of a clear sky. The baby came just before sunrise, on a morning when the sky was the color of raw wool and the wind carried the scent of pine sap and damp soil. Phoebe had woken in the night with a tightness low in her belly, and by the time Braden lit the lamp, her jaw was clenched and her breath came shallow. He didn't ask questions. He stoked the fire, boiled water, and laid out clean cloths exactly where she could reach them. He moved with the same quiet certainty he used when mending a fence or calming a panicked horse. Phoebe could see the worry in his eyes, but he never let it rise to his voice. She labored through the dark hours with her hands gripping the edge of the bed frame, sweat cooling on her neck, the child inside her fighting its way into the world. When the first cry split the hush of dawn, Braden's shoulders eased for the first time in hours. He wrapped the baby in one of the soft flannel rags Phoebe had sewn weeks before and placed the bundle gently into her arms. "It's a girl," he said, voice raw but steady. Phoebe looked down at the small face, eyes still closed, mouth searching. Her chest cracked open in a way she hadn't expected, and her breath caught. "She's perfect," she whispered. Braden rested a hand lightly on her shoulder, his thumb brushing once across her collarbone. "You did it." Phoebe didn't sleep that day. She stayed awake, watching the way the newborn's small fingers curled and uncurled, how her chest rose in tiny, steady breaths. Braden moved through the cabin quietly, bringing her water, heating broth, checking the horses. Everything he did like it mattered and like she mattered. That evening, Braden sat beside the bed while Phoebe fed the baby, his hands resting on his knees. He watched, not with awe, but something more sober, like he understood the weight of what had changed between them. "She'll need a name," he said after a while. Phoebe nodded. "I was thinking Clara, after my grandmother. She had a voice like a fiddle and kept honey in her apron pockets." He smiled faintly. "Clara Oakes, then. She'll grow strong out here." Phoebe looked up. "I want her to. I want her to know every inch of this land, to feel safe in it the way I never did anywhere else." "She will," Braden said. "We'll show her." A week later, Phoebe stepped outside for the first time since the birth. The sun was high, and the air smelled of wild chamomile and fresh-cut hay. She held Clara close against her chest in a sling she'd stitched from an old muslin petticoat. Braden had rigged a bench beneath the cottonwood near the corral, and they sat there together, the baby asleep between them. Phoebe leaned back, her head against his shoulder. "Do you think you'll ever want to leave this place?" Braden shook his head. "No. I built this with my own hands. But I'd burn it down if it meant keeping you both safe." She turned to look at him. "I don't need that. I just need you to stay." "I will," he said, "for the rest of my life." That night, after Clara had settled, Phoebe stood barefoot at the hearth, brushing her hair loose from its braid. Braden came in from the barn, his shirt damp from evening chores, and stopped in the doorway like he hadn't expected to see her standing in the firelight. She turned slowly to face him. "I've been thinking." He waited. Phoebe stepped closer, her voice low. "I want to marry you. Not because I need protection or a roof. I want to raise Clara with you. I want to share the quiet mornings and the long days. I want to build something with you, not just live in what's already here." Braden's eyes didn't leave hers. "You sure?" "Yes," she said. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He didn't answer with words. He took her hand in both of his and pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in like he needed to memorize the shape of that moment. They were married the next Sunday, beneath the cottonwood, with the creek running slow behind them and the grass combed flat by the wind. The preacher from town rode out with a Bible and a calm voice, and Clara slept through the whole thing in Phoebe's arms. Afterward, Braden lifted Phoebe's hand to his lips and kissed the knuckles, then the palm, then the inside of her wrist. She wrapped her arms around his waist and held him close, neither of them speaking. They didn't need to. That summer passed in long days and quiet evenings. Phoebe began tending a small garden near the porch: beans, squash, and a row of early corn. Braden built a cradle from scrap pine and lined it with wool from a neighbor's sheep. At night, they took turns walking Clara when she fussed, passing her back and forth with sleepy smiles and soft humming. By autumn, the valley had turned gold, and Clara laughed for the first time clear and bright, like the sound of water over stone. Braden had been holding her when it happened, and he'd gone still, like he was afraid to move, like the sound might vanish if he breathed too loud. Phoebe had watched him, her heart full to the edges. "She has your patience," she said. "She has your fire," he replied. They didn't talk about the past anymore. It had happened, and it had brought them here. That was enough. In the years to come, the ranch grew a little. 2 more horses, a chicken coop, a second cradle. But the cabin stayed the same, warm, worn, and full of light. Clara learned to walk along the fence lines, her hands brushing the tops of the grass. She followed Braden through the pasture and helped Phoebe collect eggs in the morning. Her laughter became part of the land. Phoebe taught her to read under the cottonwood, and Braden taught her how to ride. Together, they built a life not out of ease, but out of care, each day shaped by the same quiet choice: to stay, to love, to endure. And through it all, Phoebe never stopped watching Braden with the same steady awe, the kind that comes from knowing the thing you'd once thought impossible had not only arrived, but taken root. They grew old together beneath the wide Wyoming sky, side by side, with nothing left to run from and everything to hold on to.